I like sugar. Yeah, I've decided. Quite a bit.
Actually, it stays, right?
Yeah, it does.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Jennifer Howell here at DPSST. So we're calling to order the Criminal Justice Moral Fitness Workgroup meeting, October 16th, 2024 at 9 a.m. Meeting here at DPSST in the boardroom. DPSST is located at 4190 Elmsville Highway Southeast, Salem, Oregon. And we are also have a hybrid meeting facilitated through Teams. The meeting is recorded and will be posted to the DPSST YouTube page, and this is the administrative announcement. This is a public meeting subject to public meeting law. The meeting is digitally recorded and posted to the DPSST YouTube webpage after the meeting. The meeting will also be reported in the form of written minutes. Just be mindful of comments and side conversation. One moment. Okay. All right. So for ease of review, we'll go around the room so everyone online can find out who's in the room, and then I can go through the list of participants who are logged in online. So again, Jennifer Howell, DPSST. Got McAlpine, DPSST.
Rob Wood, Police Policy Committee member. Sharon Barr, Public.
Carol Deshawn, Oregon Department of Corrections.
Kathy Fink, DPSST.
Jennifer Lavario, DPSST.
Online, we have Shannon Anderson with the Police Policy Committee, Angela Brandenburg, the Police Policy Committee, Mark Warren for the Corrections Policy Committee, Mark Day for the Police Policy Committee, Rhonda Griffin, the Telecommunications Policy Committee, Andy Hyder representing Oregon State Police, Erica Stolhan representing Hood River Sheriff's Office. And is there anyone that I haven't seen signed in yet that didn't get Melissa Lang for DPSST, and anyone else who came in while I wasn't looking.
We know who that phone number is.
We do have a phone number, and it may be somebody who's just logged in 2 times. It's the 971-979. John Frost has also joined us. I think that is. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and dive right on in. So just a bit of a recap, because we did adjourn mid-discussion last time. We had started, it was our August 7th meeting, and we were reviewing the standards for the Applicant Review Committee and the pre-employment standards for those individuals who are new hires to public safety and have criminal dispositions that occurred in their past. I wanted to review what we previously discussed as a refresher to the conversations that we'll pick up today. And of course, you're welcome to ask questions and bring up any additional thoughts that you've had since we ran out of time in August. The pre-employment standards and the applicant committee review processes apply to criminal dispositions that occurred prior to employment as a public safety professional. If the conduct did not result in a criminal disposition, as it's defined in the administrative rule, then the conduct is not subject to further certification review. So in these cases, DPSST can't move forward on arrest or citation alone. There has to be a final disposition. If the criminal conduct occurs during or after public safety employment in any jurisdiction, so if they did it if they were employed as a officer or telecommunicator in another state, and the criminal disposition occurred while they were employed there or after they left employment there, then that means that it goes through the regular policy committee process and the discretionary proceedings, because they've been held to a public safety standard in the past. So the applicant review committee only reviews the criminal dispositions that occur before any employment in public safety. And so there were no work group questions or concerns with the application of those current rules at this time. The work group reviewed the moral fitness violation definitions for dishonesty and gross misconduct that staff use and the applicant review committee use. Those are on page 3 of your memo. The work group affirmed that changes to dishonesty should be consistent with any changes to the definition of dishonesty that we use for the discretionary cases that go to corrections, telecommunications, and police policy committee. And earlier, when we were reviewing dishonesty for those, there was a recommendation to add actions to conceal misconduct to the definition of dishonesty. And when we talked about this in August, this work group was comfortable reflecting that same change for the dishonesty for the pre-employment standard. They wanted to keep that. The last time you discussed it, you wanted to keep it consistent in both places. The work group also discussed if and how to define significant harm, which is part of the definition of gross misconduct. And ultimately, after some conversation, recommended keeping the language as written and that DPSST staff should continue to apply the definition broadly and forward cases to the applicant review committee to determine if the conduct violated moral fitness standards. The next topic was the aggravating and mitigating circumstances on page 4. The work group reviewed the processes for consideration of aggravating and mitigating circumstances. For the pre-employment standard, the applicant review committee is required to consider that the applicant was not employed in a certifiable position at the time of the conduct, and the applicant has been hired by a public safety agency who's aware of the criminal background. The applicant review committee does have discretion on how much weight they give to those mitigating circumstances when they're making their decision. But the work group in the August meeting affirmed this practice of always considering those things, and did not identify any additional circumstances that needed to be reviewed or considered in every case. So basically keeping everything as it currently is in the process for aggravating and mitigating. And of course, when they review the case, they get the opportunity to identify additional items, not just those 2 items. The next part of the process were the ineligibility periods, which we've discussed many times. And the work group reaffirmed that the current ineligibility periods apply to the pre-employment criminal dispositions. So upholding the current process, which is the minimum of 0 days and the maximum of 10 years. And for those, the start date of the ineligibility period is the criminal disposition, the date of the criminal disposition. So it's a start date that always occurred in the past. So when we were wrapping up at the end of the meeting, we were in discussion of item 5 and recognizing that it was going to tie into later discussions in item 6 and other things. So just a little bit more to recap on the inquiry closures. An inquiry closure means that DPSST staff reviewed the criminal disposition and determined that there would be no action to deny training or certification. A pre-employment criminal disposition can result in closure for many reasons. It can be from having not enough information to make a determination, or that the conduct occurred more than 10 years ago. Through an internal process, the DPSST case manager makes a recommendation to close the case. That's reviewed by the criminal justice program manager, Kathy Fink, and the professional standards division director, Kathy Fink, before staff determine that it's a final for closure. Then DPSST reports the inquiry closure to the applicant review committee as an informational update. the current process does not have the ARC approve inquiry closures. It's just a reported informational update so that you have that information available as to what's happening. This is different from the administrative closure process that is in place for the discretionary moral fitness violations for currently employed public safety officers. Those are submitted to the policy committee and approved by the policy committee before they become final. As the current rule is written, the applicant review committee has the authority to review the case even if the conduct occurred more than 10 years ago. So the current closure process does not align with the original intent of the applicant review committee. And DPSST in discussion item 5 asked the work group whether or not closures should be approved by the applicant review committee. Well, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. So it would turn it into a consent agenda item.
Correct. Yeah. Well, I would say correct in that we would probably model it much like
So
but I do have more statements to that are part of 6.
don't interrupt.
So, please, the whole process is to interrupt Jennifer. Otherwise, you'll only hear me ramble. But yes, so let me speak a little bit to 6, and maybe we can combine the discussions for seeking the resolution on what to do. So 6 is talking about or highlighting that what do we do with criminal dispositions that occurred over 10 years ago? When the standards were established, the work group at that time said it's important to review that conduct and determine whether or not it should prevent someone from being certified. Even if the maximum you can apply is 10 years, and even if the committee recommended denying training and certification, and that 10 years has already passed by the time they're hired and it's reviewed. It's that process and that action of picking up the conduct and reviewing it through the lens of public safety and saying whether or not the person is fit. And the work group at that time thought it was to be able to do that. As the standards were implemented, it evolved into staff doing inquiry closures on items that were older than 10 years. Therefore, saving the committee the time, I don't know if saving the committee the time to review is the appropriate term, but that was the path that was chosen by the administration at the time, was to say, hey, committee, here's the inquiry closure. This conduct occurred more than 10 years ago. Based on the records we have, yeah, it probably includes gross misconduct, but it happened over 10 years ago, so there's nothing that can be done. But that's not actually true. The committee could still deny the training. The person would just still already be eligible to proceed with the process. So the question I have before you today is it a moral fitness violation? Is it moral fitness if it's older than 10 years? Or is it really moral fitness because it occurred within 10 years of becoming employed? And if you need me to rephrase that, let me know, but I'm gonna be quiet for a minute and let you all think and talk.
I guess in my mind, I played the what if game. What if it's so we have on the policy committees, lifetime revocation options. And let's say this occurred in another state and the moral fitness violation would have been, had it occurred here, been a lifetime, but they come to you and it was more than 10 years ago. That's the what if game I'm playing. Does that cause a problem? Because now it slips through the cracks.
Well, I'll speak to a few different points in that if it is something that would be a mandatory for us, it would still be processed as a mandatory. So if the person committed a felony in another state, that's a mandatory. So we would still automatically go through the staff process to deny that. These are the criminal dispositions that, would otherwise be discretionary, so going to the policy committee. But because they weren't employed in public safety, and because they're new hires, it shifts to the applicant review committee and that pre-employment standard versus the currently employed officer peer review discipline specific policy committees.
If I can give one example that, we might see is, somebody before they were hired in public safety had a theft disposition, which we all know if somebody did it while they were hired as public safety, that's a dishonesty. And so in 10 years, does an individual's moral fitness change? Can they mature? Can they make life changes? And therefore, say in 10 years, because also we know that an agency has hired them and believe that they have a lot more in-depth reason why they feel this person who maybe committed a theft greater than 10 years ago is different than today. And so those are some of the considerations. And then oftentimes the challenges that we have is finding the records. We might have the arrest, but finding the police report that might tell us a little bit more of, did they fight with the police? Did they give false information? So a lot of times we see these closures because it was over 10 years and there's not enough records to bring it forward to tell a little bit more about perhaps somebody's character. That helps at all.
Well, for the record, in that kind of a scenario, it seems to me that, at least I would hope that in the process of the background that the agency conducts, that they would be able to delve into that more deeply and determine that, certainly make their hiring decision based on whether or not there was any other kind of circumstances.
So the concern with that, because I've seen this happen before, the agency looks at something during their background check and says, okay, they've matured since then. Now does it come before the applicant review committee to agree with that or not?
And the same is true. DPSST could not review it because it's older than 10 years, but the employer could still go, no, that's not something that we want as an applicant in our agency. Yeah.
So, and this may be backing up quite a bit, but what mechanics send cases, I guess I'd call it, to staff? Is it something so that an applicant, an agency hires someone or gives a conditional hire based on a background, they do a background, they find something, are they obligated to send things to you saying, hey, there's some history here in another state or pre-employment? Or is it discretionary? Do they decide to send it so it doesn't pop up later?
Jennifer Lavario for the record. So when an applicant applies for training, they have to turn in an F-28, which is their entire criminal history. Whether or not they've shared it with the agency is not we're more concerned about their entire criminal history. So they have to turn that into us anyways. Then we will also do our own criminal history check through LEDS. And we'll look at that criminal history to determine what, if anything, there needs to be investigated further.
So Jennifer, you do all applicants then?
Correct.
Oh, okay. Didn't realize that.
Yes. And so we have a process. We have several people involved in that initial hire or training application process. Yeah.
Okay.
But the first submission is they want to get into like a basic academy. So that's when we'll get that form. And then we'll do our own check. So they can't get in here until they're hired by an agency.
Correct.
But there's certain things in the background that have changed that mandate you check things One of them is DPSST to see if there's anything there. So oftentimes, the agency, I would say, since I've been here, are aware of the arrest back then. And again, the part we try and do is our own independent. So we don't just say, okay, agency, give us all your criminal records that you found. We're trying to find them ourselves. And we have at times found some different things. So that's that check and balance as well. Oh, Melissa has.
Go ahead, Melissa.
Melissa Langbacher for the record. I just wanted to add that we have an administrative role that gives us access to agency's background information, but the information that we're looking at is limited to their criminal disposition. So there may be arrests that are discovered or identified in their background, but it's not something that we have the ability to look at necessarily. It has to meet the definition of the criminal disposition for us to review it.
Melissa, can you give one or two examples, a little bit more? So that, what if it was not charged or deferred? Are you talking about?
Well, so the criminal disposition includes a lot of things. So if they've pled guilty or no contest, but their case is dismissed, we still have the ability to look at it because it meets our definition. But if there's no plea of guilt and no finding of guilt or no contest or adjudication in that sense, and the case gets dismissed, then we aren't able to look at it. And I think I've seen some people report that they've been arrested to us, but not actually criminally charged. So we're not able to look at those things that they've been arrested for, but not adjudicated. So we're looking at the cases that have an outcome that's not just a dismissal. So we need some sort of conviction to go along with that, whether it's a plea or a finding of guilt.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So in part, the question is, if the criminal disposition occurred more than 10 years ago, should it still be reviewed for those moral fitness violations of dishonesty and gross misconduct? Or because the 10-year ineligibility period is the maximum amount of time that can be prescribed to say you're denied, you can't apply to be a certified individual for a 10-year period. But if that time has already passed, does that mean then that the passage of time is such a mitigator in that factor that it's no longer something that needs to be reviewed? So if it still needs to be reviewed, because that's how the original work group intended it, was that it doesn't matter when it occurred, it still needs to be reviewed, still needs to be acknowledged as its potential moral fitness. Then what is the next step when we find that there is something that is older than 10 years, has dishonesty or gross misconduct? Is it something that still gets presented to the committee for the committee to review and make a recommendation to deny or not deny? Or as a full case, or is it presented as that here's a closure, we recommend closing this because it is older than 10 years? And if we're closing it, does the committee need to approve closure? Okay. Go ahead, Chief Anderson.
All right, I'm gonna try. I don't think I can answer these all in like one thing, but here's kind of where I'm leaning is that when we have like automatics that we just don't open things up for, we don't look at it and we don't articulate it, sometimes it can look like we're not doing something thoroughly. So I lean towards maybe that it is addressed, we discuss it, but there's some type of documentation that says why it's not moved on. But at least it's there, it's documented, so it doesn't look like it was overlooked, missed, that, there's some odd thing happening or a cover up or something like that. I think, I don't know, it just seems a little bit safer and more professional. And that's it.
Any other thoughts on mine?
Kevin McAlpin, for the record, Chief, can I just clarify what I think you mean is, again, that transparency is, the recommendation would be to have admin closures come to the committee to review and look at, but there's still admin closures, but you want to take a look at them or actually consider them and whether or not, they should be denied certification, the potential for certification.
Yeah, I think if we're saying that there's rules and limits that we should follow those, but we should document that that's what happened. So maybe it does come to the committee and it's just listed out like these things occurred, or it's listed somewhere in the documentation of the review. I don't know if this is possible. It just seems like rather than having it be automatically not looked at, that just seems kind of rot for something to happen. Someone to at least make it look like they slipped through the cracks. This at least articulates like, hey, the agency or everybody knew about this, but it fit within these guidelines. Therefore, we're moving on or we're pushing it through. I guess I think about nobody's are extremes, right? But folks these days, they want things in front of them. They want it outlined. If we have to go look at it to articulate why it wasn't moved through or why we didn't look at it, then it just leaves things to slip through the cracks in the question of the work that we did. It's like showing your math. You got to show your work. You can't just like put 15 down. You got to show that 3 times 5 is 15. I hope I clarified that.
I think that you did.
You did, thank you.
And I think in reading the room and the discussion so far, the work group would still find value in continuing to review anything, no matter if it's older than 10 years or not. But it's important to continue that look process. So then what we need to figure out is what is that documentation process of the look? Is it that DPSST says to the policy committee, here is a closure. We looked at this, it is older than 10 years, but it does include dishonesty or misconduct, and the committee has to approve it, or they just accept the report as informational, because that's the form of document, that is a form of documentation, that's the current form of documentation. Or does it need to be a case where we present all of the materials and the committee identifies aggravating and mitigating and votes on whether or not to deny or not deny?
I guess my thought is on that maybe it's just put for information. And since anybody can then start a case, if somebody feels that it's something that should be looked at further, then they can report that so it can be looked at further. But at least you're bringing it forward. And I think I interrupted somebody. I'll mute.
All right, John Frost, you're up next.
John Frost. Sorry. My thought was, I agree with Chief Anderson that it should be brought before the committee, but I think kind of like the way corrections policy has it right now, I'm trying to remember what I saw. I know the last meeting that we had like 13 reviews of staff, and we went for like 3 hours or something. It was a marathon session, it felt like. And then, but then there was all these case closed, like, and there was just a whole bunch of them. And we looked at it, but we didn't, other than say, yes, DPSST did the right thing and they closed these cases. Hey, great. And I think that's where we should be at with that. These cases were looked at, and we didn't, DPSST staff decided that it was beyond 10 years or there wasn't going to be any issue with these people, and that then the policy committees can just be like, you're good, go ahead. It's kind of the way I feel about it, but that's because I could see your policy committees becoming marathon sessions that go on for hours if we have to review every single person that's coming before the board.
Okay, so Robin, for the record, I think I'm going to restate what I think I'm hearing is if staff looks at history and they find it's a moral fitness violation that would have been 10 years or less and 10 years have transpired, it would be on the consent agenda. But if it was a moral fitness violation that the staff believes would have been lifetime, I think that should be a case presented before the applicant review committee. Is that what you're agreeing, Chief Anderson?
Yeah, I think that sounds reasonable.
So in the pre-employment standard, there's not a lifetime in the discretionary. If it is something that is so egregious that it falls within those mandatory, then the committees would never see the mandatory. So when there's felonies, when it's convictions involving drug offenses, sex offender registration, a conviction for a bias crime,
Domestic violence.
conviction for a domestic violence, those things are automatic, and DPSST processes them administratively. They don't even go to the policy committees because the rule says must be denied, must be revoked. So these are the ones that come to the committees are those discretionary. So in these, the applicant review committee may deny if there's dishonesty or gross misconduct of any criminal disposition that isn't a mandatory.
So as Melissa pointed out earlier, if it's something that was arrest, but there was no conviction.
Right.
But it included dishonesty or prejudice against a protected class, that would come before the applicant committee as a case, correct?
No.
If it does not have a criminal disposition attached to it. So if it was an arrest, but nothing happened, they didn't do any charges and there were no court proceedings and there was no final disposition outcome and no plea of guilt, then it's just an arrest only. And because it's pre-employment and it happened before public safety, it doesn't rise to the level of review. But if it has a criminal disposition, then yes. So if it was and I'll review the criminal disposition definition just so. Criminal disposition includes conviction, a violation, adjudication, civil compromise, an entered plea of guilty or no contest, or a finding of guilty except for insanity or its equivalent, for any violation of a criminal law under the law of the jurisdiction where the disposition occurred. So if it's in Texas, whatever it was in Texas, it's still, it's a criminal disposition. It's a violation of law.
Let John work for the record, just so I have this straight. I mean, a real life case that occurred in my agency. I had an officer assault his wife in the presence of other officers. And, also was, we then drove a car DUI on one burst of activity. And this officer went to court. In fact, in Marion County, and the judge dismissed it because he didn't want to mess his life up, I guess. So in a dismissal, this is my concern with that. Would that show up as a judicial action that would have then appear, or because if it didn't, that's somebody beyond 10 years I would want to look at, regardless. That's my point.
Yeah, and so I would first state that in that example, we're talking about a currently employed public safety
Yeah, that's
person.
true. I forgot about that.
And that is going to be held to that higher bar. And our current rules allow us to move forward on the conduct alone, not just the criminal disposition. So the fact that that case was dismissed in today's current rules and processes, DPSST would bring that case forward to the police policy committee, the corrections policy committee, or the telecommunications policy committee. If that individual did this before they were employed in public safety, and it was within, maybe it was 5 years before they were hired, that's going to go to the applicant review committee. Well, the dismissed is the hairy part, right? It depends on if there are any court records that show that there is a finding or plea of guilt between the arrest and the dismissal. That's where we're caught up with.
Yeah.
If there's no finding or plea of guilt before it's dismissed, then DPSST doesn't have the ability right now to move forward on that for these pre-employment standards.
And what we have the company for the record, what we're trying to provide that check and balance is, you know, not every agency has, let's say, a zero tolerance on domestic violence, regardless of my agency that I had previously was, it didn't require guilty or conviction. If we know through a police report that there was an act of domestic violence, we will not hire somebody. Zero, not going to happen. But we know across this that might not be universal. So that's why we try and identify the things that we can do that double check, so that when we're all challenged with hiring people and we say we don't want to lower standards, but are we forgiving or whatever? And I think, I'm assuming that's where the work group came with 10 years and then not these mandatory things because life happens. But yeah, so the presumption then on that case is that an agency did their review and thought for whatever reason this individual was worthy of hiring because there was no conviction, and now we're looking to see if they should be awarded a certification.
Let me ask staff, Jennifer and Melissa, a clarifying question. In this scenario, would this be something that was an inquiry that would lead to a closure? So there would be documentation of, we looked at this, but because our rules are written this way, we're not, it doesn't move forward for review, but it's something that's acknowledged in documentation through that inquiry closure process.
If this was a pre-employment, okay, without the disposition, and like you said, not seeing the records on whether there was and correct me if I'm wrong here, Melissa, but without seeing those court records to see whether an entry of guilty or no contest was provided, if that was provided, then we could look at it, write something up and close it. If it wasn't provided, we wouldn't be looking at it. Yeah, it
Yeah.
really comes down to reality. But yes, to answer your question about a report, if we are looking at something that's over the 10-year mark, we're gonna write it up like we would if you've been on a policy committee, like an administrative closure. We're gonna tell you what we found, we're gonna write up as much as we can, and then we're gonna on the bottom say, and here's why we're closing this case. Because we don't have the supporting information or the rule says we can't take it any further.
But it is documented.
It is documented. So it could be as simple as, if the committee decides this way, as changing that from an inquiry closure to an administrative closure, presenting it to you like we would to the policy committees, for you to have on a consent agenda. That way you would see what the conduct was, and you could say something like, well, this case, we'd rather you bring it back and take a look at it further.
Melissa Langbottom for the record. I was just gonna add that if the scenario that was presented of the judge dismissing a case without a finding of guilt or no contest or any sort of action to that extent, it wouldn't even be something that we ask the officers to report. We only ask them to report criminal dispositions, and so if they know that they weren't found guilty, there was no plea of no contest, and they weren't found guilty by a jury or the judge, they wouldn't need to report it to us. So it may be something that we never even discover if they fill out the forms as we ask them to.
If I could just provide one more, Jennifer Lombardo for the record. However, a case like that can come in through the back door as a complaint. So if it came in as a complaint, say an officer decided to file a complaint, then there is another option for looking at it as a case.
So to do a little recap and see if we're on the same track. Again, continued value and continuing to review anything, no matter if it's older than 10 years. And then DPSST updating its processes and practices so that it's not an informational report of closure, but it is a recommendation for closure that the applicant review committee approves.
And that would be the change, correct?
That would be the change. The change would be changing it from an informational only report to something that the committee would be able to say, we want more information on case number A.
So Captain Calvin, for the record, just before you decide or decide, the only thing I'm gonna offer in consideration is, as it stands currently, we meet monthly and we can't get a quorum. Some of you have had officers that are, and so far we've been lenient, and we know we've talked in this work group about whether or not we want to tighten that up, is when there was a backlog, while we were reviewing, while we were waiting for the committee to take a look at this, your employees were allowed to be registered into the academy. And so if we add these closures and going from, where you guys need to approve the closures just for that then we would definitely need more of a commitment for people to attend, have a quorum, so that we can timely make a decision so that we can get these folks into the academy and resolved before they start the academy. So it's documented no matter what, but if it requires now the committee to actually make a vote and agree with that, I just would like to make sure that whoever's on the committee shows up and that we can do that, because there could be a backlog or a delay. There could be an impact, by switching to that method. So I just want that to be, a consideration when you guys talk about that.
Deshawn, for the record. So I know when I was on the applicant review committee, there were a lot of months that we didn't meet just because we didn't have any cases to hear.
Mhm.
Is that not the case anymore? Are they so busy at ARC that doesn't happen anymore?
I would say ebbs and flows,
Okay.
but changing the closures to something that is a voting
Yeah.
item
Would impact that.
would
Absolutely.
impact the, because we're constantly working on closures. Right.
Mhm.
And so, right now, because they're informational only, we could skip the month of September and just report those closures in October. Because it's not impacting whether or not they can attend the academy.
Right.
If it becomes a voting item, then it perhaps impacts whether or not they can attend the academy, and we may need to hold a meeting even just for one inquiry closure.
Gotcha. Makes sense. So then is there a difference in trying to figure out how to ask this so it makes sense coming out of my mouth, makes sense in my head? Is there a difference in how it's documented? So if I'm never worked in public safety and I'm coming before ARC because I did something 12 years ago
Mhm.
and their limit is 10 years, is there a difference in how it's documented, whether it comes to the committee or not? So I guess my question, I'm trying to figure out how to make this clear. So if there's an actual case that comes before ARC, and it's mine, just as an example, is that put in a file somewhere here that has my name on it that says she came before ARC, this was the case, this is what was decided?
I'm going to say broadly, yes.
So,
So because it was 12 years old, that documentation is the informational report that says inquiry closure. DPSST reviewed this criminal disposition, found that the DUI was gross misconduct because it caused significant harm, but it is older than 10 years. Therefore, we recommend its closure.
so then I get employed. If I get another DUI 5 years after I get employed, is that considered at some point? So that when it goes to, for my case, would be CPC, would they be given the information 12 years before she was employed? We looked at this, she had a Dewey, now she has another one. That's where I'm trying to make the connection. So if it's not going to be considered 5 years later when I do the same thing, then I guess I don't understand why this is such a big issue now. If it is going to be considered 5 years after I'm employed when I do the same stupid thing, then it makes sense to me that it needs to go before the committee and actually not just be an inquiry closure, but be a consent agenda.
Yeah, so it would appear, so if something happens while employed and a case goes to the policy committee, we would include that historical information. It may or may not be a factor in that committee's decision, but the information that we had at the time of past criminal history would be included in the overall.
But would it still be included if it was just an inquiry closure, I think is my question.
Jennifer Lavario, for the record, yes, we
Okay.
can consider anything
Okay.
that's in the officer's file.
Okay.
It may not be part of the substantiation of the moral fitness violation.
Right.
Probably be more of a other relevant
Yeah,
circumstances.
absolutely.
But I have two other things I want to add to Carol's question in terms of the officer being kind of listed now. In administrative closures in policy committees, we actually list the name of the officer on the agenda.
Correct.
In the ARC committee, we have not been listing the name of the officer. in terms of telling you about the inquiry closures, was telling you there are a number of them being closed. So this is something that could change depending on how it's worked out. The fact that now that officer's name is on an agenda. Whereas before that officer's name was not on an agenda because the closure was happening before you saw it. The other thing we do with administrative closures is we post them on our website. We do not post inquiry closures on our website. So that's just some other pieces of that change.
I mean, I think for me, it works either way. As my big thing was knowing that it's still gonna show up later if they do something else and end up before a committee later. It's still gonna be part of that as far as information, so that the committee that might be hearing this case understands that they had a history prior, and they can take that into consideration for either mitigating or aggravating circumstances.
Robert, for the record, I think we were getting somewhere with plugging a hole that could occur. Well, although I appreciate Kathy Hines' concern with getting a quorum, I think that needs to be fixed over changing something could fall through the cracks someday. I like the fact of having I keep calling it a consent agenda or a case that gets ratified by the committee for the record. Because not only does that protect the public, it also protects the officer or the applicant, let me say the applicant, because if it's been heard and decided on in the applicant review committee, then it potentially or lessens the chance of it coming back up later.
True.
Because there's a record of it.
Yeah. You can see that.
So how can we fix the applicant review committee quorum issue? Can you increase the number of members or something?
We can talk about that in just a few minutes. So is there work group consensus that there's value in the applicant review committee making a determination on closures? That DPSST says, these are our recommended closures, and the applicant review committee approves those closures.
And if I understand it correctly, they would have the ability to pull it off of a closure and turn it into a case. Okay.
Now, sometimes we're limited, and we'll be forward and say, we have already gathered all of the records we can, and there just aren't any. Or it's set aside or expunged, or what, there are no records, those types of things. And then that's available for discussion at that time in the committee, and what could or could not be reviewed. So, all right. So I'm writing down that, yes, we're going to continue to review older than 10 years, and all closures are going, the recommended change is that instead of being informational only, that there'll be recommendations to the applicant review committee. And that would take care of the discussion in item 5 and item 6. All right. So item number 7 is on page 8. And this goes back to DUI diversions. And we had this conversation when we were reviewing language for DPSST administrative closure of DUIs, when we're looking at the discretionary for a currently employed public safety professional. So when they set up these pre-employment standards for new applicants, we brought over that similar language. It's worded a little bit differently because it's a different situation, but it had that same intent, that if it was a DUI that was successfully dismissed and it was the only charge, that staff wouldn't even have to open a case to look at it. When this work group reviewed that concept in June. The work group reviewed DUI administrative closure criteria for currently employed public safety professionals and recommended changing the process to allow staff the discretion to recommend closing the case or submitting the case to the policy committee for review based on the conduct that occurred. So that recognizes that just because the DUI was successfully diverted and dismissed doesn't mean that it doesn't include dishonesty and gross misconduct. Those things can still be there. And should they be reviewed as that conduct process? So the question for you with this item is, should this be maintained as an exception? Or should we make the changes that you all discussed for the currently employed officers, giving staff the discretion to either recommend it as closure or submit it to the committee for full review of the conduct? Instead of just saying, hey, it was successfully diverted and dismissed, we don't have to look at it.
Carol Deshawn, for the record, I will say, I think that it needs to follow more along the lines of what you see already for CPC and PPC as far as, sure, the Dewey was diverted, but when they punched the officer and tried to run, or when they, you know, that stuff still needs to be reviewed even by ARC, in my opinion. It still speaks to their moral character.
Uh-oh, I
You
lost
just
it.
locked up, it's back.
Came back.
Computer blanked.
Okay. So instead of automatically not looking at those, we'll now make those the discretion of staff to either recommend closure, which we now have a recommendation for the committee to review and approve, or to go ahead and say, no, this has conduct in it that needs complete case review by the committee. Okay.
I think that
Then we'll-
sounds good.
Head nods I see on the screen there and in the room. Okay, one more question. Before we get into the makeup of the committee, and that is regarding that pre-employment standard. The administrative rule states that pre-employment criminal dispositions are dispositions that occurred prior to any employment in any jurisdiction as a public safety officer, and it lists all of our different disciplines. So this means that if the person was employed in an Oregon equivalent public safety position in another state, or maybe they served in the military in a law enforcement capacity, and they have a criminal disposition, if it occurred before they were employed in that state or served in that capacity in the military, then it still falls under that pre-employment standard of they did it before they were ever involved in public safety. Okay. But let's say they committed that crime while they were employed in another state, or while they were serving in that law enforcement capacity in the military, or after they left. So a person worked in Idaho, left public safety, a couple years passed, then they come to Oregon, but in between leaving there and coming to Oregon to work in public safety, we'll just use those DUIs as the easy picking fruit, whatever they did. They have that criminal disposition because they had already been employed in public safety and have been held to a public safety standard in some jurisdiction. Those become the policy committee discretionary cases
Of that discipline.
because it's no longer something that you did before you were ever in a public service capacity. So the question is, do we continue to apply that interpretation, or do we need to broaden it to be only public safety in Oregon? So prior to employment and public safety in Oregon, meaning that you can have criminal dispositions in other states while you're employed that would still be eligible for review through the applicant review committee versus the policy committees. Or is that just splitting hairs too closely.
Rob Wood, for the record, I put that back as, what is the staff one? Because either way, it comes before some kind of committee for ratification or consent. What do you think?
Oh, Rob.
Shannon Anderson here. Am I following the question? Are you asking if pre-employment criminal dispositions only, we're looking at it only for employment in Oregon or outside of like the broader scope? Because if we're looking at the broader scope, I think it should be maintained that it includes everything. So somebody's deployed, they're overseas, they're working in as military police, there's some type of conduct. I think we should be looking at it.
Yeah, and we would still look at it. It's just a matter of which lens do we look at it? Do we look at it as a pre-employment lens? Or do we look at it as a employed public safety officer lens?
I vote for employed public safety officer lens.
I was gonna say, the example I can give you most recently, and I believe the Police Policy Committee reviewed it, similar to the example that Jennifer gave, actively served in another state as a police officer, left their employment, obtained a DUI while now a civilian, but they did have that certification. Now coming here a couple years later, hired by an agency, but to look at that DUI, that pre-employment, it went to the Police Policy Committee for consideration versus, do we think that is something that could be done by ARC? Right? Did I interpret that right? Yeah. So for those who sit on the policy committees, do you want to see those there? Is that more consistent with the pre-employment? And that's something that the ARC can do.
Carol Deshawn, for the record, I think that it needs to stay personally where it is with the policy committees. I think once you're employed in public safety, whether it be Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Australia, wherever, you're held to that higher standard. And you should still be held to that higher standard when you leave one state and come to another, in my opinion. I think that the policy committees have a broader lens that they look at it through, because they have, ARC has a 10-year limit and the policy committees don't. They have a lifetime if there's dishonesty found that they think is egregious enough. So I think it needs to be looked at through the lens of the policy committees, not through ARC.
Okay, I see head nods online as well. So the recommendation is to continue to maintain the current application, which is pre-employment applies to any jurisdiction. So it has to have occurred before you were ever employed in public safety anywhere. So that's fine. That's good. That was a quick one. All right. Page 10, number 9 is talking about the applicant review committee, its membership, its representation, how they're appointed, and the terms that they serve. So just broadly, the applicant review committee has 7 members right now. 2 are from the corrections policy committee, 2 are from the police policy committee, 2 are from the telecommunications policy committee, and 1 is a public member of the board. So I will note that the public member of the board, when this was established, there was only 1 public member of the board. And since then, the board has now 3 public members. So where it was supposed to be a default of you were the 1 public member on the board, now you would serve on the applicant review committee. Now there are multiple people that could pull from that. I don't want to get too rambling. Let's see. So 2 members from each committee is intended to provide that equal representation across the disciplines because it is a multidiscipline committee. Including the public member of the board was intended to include that public representation on the applicant review committee. And then it also then made sure that at least one of the applicant review committee persons was also a board member, because it's not a requirement that you be a board member in order to serve on the applicant review committee, except for that one board position. Okay. And it's important to recognize that serving on the applicant review committee is an additional duty for any board or committee member. For our board's public member positions, this has resulted in an extra duty that wasn't really included in the application process. So they applied to be on the board and didn't know that there were going to be these additional committees that we would need service for, like the Public Safety Memorial Fund, the Applicant Review Committee, and so on and so forth. So questions that we'll review today are there any recommended changes to the membership positions? Should there still be a board member in addition to the policy committee members, or is it sufficient just to have policy committee members? If there is a board member included in the applicant review committee, does it need to be one of the 3 public members? So could it be a different board member who serves? These are overlapping. I'm sorry, getting to that rambling point again. Let's talk about how appointment works. To be eligible for nomination to the applicant review committee, the nominee must have served 1 term as a policy committee member. So while we have a fairly large policy committee of, around 10 members, only a portion of those would be eligible for nomination to the policy committee, because when they established this, they wanted to make sure that people on the applicant review committee were familiar with reviewing cases and applying the moral fitness standards. So that limits the pool of individuals who can serve. And then those individuals may have scheduling challenges, which would then later impact our quorum abilities. So one thing to consider may be changing that requirement that there be prior experience on the policy committee, and either reducing the amount of that experience or eliminating that experience requirement, meaning that any person who's currently seated on the policy committee can serve in the applicant review committee process. And then currently the applicant review committee member serves a 1-year term and can be reappointed to a 2nd year. And then we wrote in this process where if you were a policy committee member and you were appointed to the ARC, that you could then relinquish your policy committee duties so that you could only serve on the ARC and not have to have the dual workloads. So open for discussion and questions. Happy to provide any clarifications. But what are your thoughts on membership and terms and appointments?
Is a quorum 1 over average or 1 over, what is the quorum, the definition for this?
It's not, yes, it is the majority. So for this, because it's a 7, it's 4.
So increasing the numbers could help that.
Right?
Good.
But
It could help, it could.
yeah, it depends. More people stop.
Some people.
Flash on board for the record. Now, Jennifer, are you saying that it's a fairly consistent problem to get a quorum?
I would have to defer to you all who have been in the scheduling portion of the committees.
I would say not even more than sometimes some of our other committees, but I would say more the board, not so much the other discipline committees. But it does happen, and I just want, because of the frequency, my whole intent was just to say those who know they're trying to get their people in and they're waiting for that review to happen and to do it timely, we need to then make sure that we can have committee members come and, make those decisions. Part of it is just, we try and communicate that. We do have an agenda we're short one. We're doing a better job of reaching out individually and saying, it's online, can you do that? And really trying hard. But it has happened, and I just want to That's probably, it's happened a little bit more in the ARC than it has any other committees. And so it was more for giving you a bigger picture that, you know, the unintended consequences, I guess, of saying they're both still closures, but one now requires a vote. Now we gotta make sure we can't kick it off to another committee. Is that the intent? Are we okay with that? Outside of that, I've had the privilege of serving on ARC as a police policy committee. And so oftentimes when we're recruiting, as I say, it really is quicker and a lower bar. It's not as intensive as we're used to in the various committees where you might have 1,500 pages to read.
Yeah.
Things of that nature. So.
And all positions, Robert, are filled currently. All 7 are filled really by.
I would say that the board member position is vacant.
Yes.
Yes.
And has been consistently vacant for probably the past 2 years. So while we always had one public member of the board appointment process is so lengthy and goes through the governor's office and Senate confirmation that there have been times where we haven't been able to fill it because we only had one public member, and that one public member did not have the availability and capacity to serve on these additional committees.
So with 6 eligible, you still have to have 4, and that's where
Right.
sometimes it
2
gets.
people don't show.
Right.
Could there be alternates that are designated and approved, that have their 1 year on the policy committees? That then a member of the ARC can say, I can't make it. And the alternate go in that place. That might solve some of the issues.
I believe anything's possible. At this point. anything's
Does the
possible.
board set these rules?
Yes, through the recommendations. So through the discussions that you all have.
Yeah.
And solutions that you propose will be written up as administrative rule changes for what currently exists. And those will go through the policy committee. The policy committee reviews it. We'll ask that, because it's the applicant review committee, we'll ask the applicant review committee to review the idea so that those members also get to weigh in on it.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. And then it goes through public comment and board approval process. Sheriff Brandenburg?
Sure. Yes, Sheriff Brandenburg, for the record. So the intent, I think, for the board member is a public member. That's one question. And then number 2 is the police policy committees have public members that are on the ARC as well. So there is representation from the public, right? So is there a way of taking out the public member designation from the board so that there's a greater pool of folks to be on the ARC?
I would say yes. Because whenever it was originally planned, we didn't know that the individual committees, public members were going to, volunteer and want to be participants. But I would say, yes, historically, we have always had a public member. They just weren't a member of the board. They were from the policy committee. And at some points, I think even 2 of the applicant committee review members were public members from committees, just not on the board. So yes, that can absolutely be updated.
So, Mark, for the record, I would totally agree with that. It's just, I think that the board should just leave them to appoint a member. And then maybe they can find somebody that's really willing to commit to the ARC. So, pretty sure, even though I see value in a public member, you also have to get the work done.
Yeah, Sheriff Brandenburg, and to that end, I think if the policy committees work with staff and are mindful of the makeup of the ARC, that we could, ensure perhaps if we have public members from the committees that would like to serve, that we prioritize that during the selection process.
Okay, how important is the prior experience requirement prior to serving on the applicant review committee?
And Captain Cowboy, for the record, put it in context again, a 1 year, assuming they attended all of them, you're talking about exposure to 4 committees. If you were to say 6 months, attending 2 is all that really, you get the pace of play and something like that, you may, so difference between maybe 2 and 4.
Well, it's actually the 2-year term. So a policy committee member is serving a 2-year term. Right now, to be on the applicant review committee, you have to have served 1 2-year term. You have to be,
1 2 years.
yeah, you have to be in your second
Okay.
2-year, you have to be in your second term on the policy committee to be eligible for the applicant review committee. So how much experience, if experience is required, is necessary? And then again, that contrast of if you change the experience requirements, then you open up eligibility to more people to serve, more people who can, are available to balance their schedules versus taxing one smaller group of individuals who are probably already very full agendas. Sheriff Einiger?
Yeah, so this came up recently for me. I believe it was the ARC committee that I was raising my hand to serve on, but hadn't met that minimum requirement. So I don't personally, I don't think that's necessary. I think to serve the first full term. I think that limits us, and with such great staff guiding us, I don't think that should matter from personal experience.
Deshawn, for the record, so when new committee members start, do you guys still do the same training with them on how the process works that you've done? I mean, I went through it years ago.
I would say we've actually enhanced it and expanded it much more.
So my opinion, I guess, is that if they're going through that training to be on one of the committees, they already have the basic knowledge of how the process works, and it's run by staff that can answer questions during the process, so I don't see the need for that time requirement, in my opinion.
Okay. Any changes to the length of an applicant review committee member term? Those applicant review committee terms are currently 1 year, reappointment eligible for an additional year. Any question or concern or change on that? Would it be okay to remove the administrative rule language that talks about if you're appointed to the applicant review committee, you're not required to serve on both committees and can?
Even though that
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. We were trying to,
I served on
Yeah.
2 at once.
yeah, and I would say at the time, we were trying to recognize the workload and the asks of people's time. But I think that looking back on that now, I think a person is appointed to the committee, the corrections, telecommunications policy committee, to represent their group and their organization, and that's, so to relinquish that, then, yeah, requires finding a whole nother person to do that, so I just thought we could clean that up and
Get rid of that.
get rid of it. And I'm not hearing an absolute objection. Sheriff Brandenburg?
Yeah, I think that sounds great. I think with the, with the ability to zoom in and not having to travel, it opens up, I think, a lot of availability for folks. So I was surprised to hear that, actually. I did not know that was a thing. So taking that out doesn't seem like that's going to be a problem.
All right, thank you. And yeah, to your point, whenever it was established, we didn't have standard Teams calls.
Right.
So a lot of evolution since the before times, right? Okay, so I just need, I'm sorry to go back for clarification on the 7 members. And we talked about changing the board membership representation. So my question for you, do we need to just remove, do you want to remove the board member entirely? Or change it from public member of the board to any member of the board?
Any
Any
member, for
member of the
me.
board is what I would change it to.
Yeah.
Okay,
I think you still want the board represented there in some capacity.
so we have board members who serve on policy committees. If we're opening the door to any person who's on a committee, and we have 2 people from each committee, would we want to explore one person who is a board member and one person who isn't a board member could serve on the applicant review committee?
I think then though that, sorry, Carol LaJean for the record, I think that would then limit the people on the board that could serve, because I know when I was on CPC and the board, there was only 2 of us on CPC that were on the board.
Okay,
So that would make it to where you'd only have 2 people from CPC that you could choose from at that point unless something has changed.
Okay.
So I think that you still need to leave it to where anybody on the committees is eligible,
okay.
as well as somebody from the board.
Jennifer Lavario, for the record, I just want to make the point that our decisions end at ARC.
Mhm.
So they don't actually go to the board for any final decision,
Mhm.
if that makes any difference in that makeup of
Yeah.
people on ARC.
I think that's why I think you need to still have some sort of board representation on ARC.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't go to them. It goes back to you guys and it's finalized.
All right,
And Captain Kelvin, for the record, just, I want to see the various different scenarios. So if I understand, and we change it to any member of the board, but we don't have the appointment criteria to that board member, meaning you had to be on a committee for 2 years. So my example would be, let's just say we have, a chief, and it could be, the chief serves on the board, but they're not on the policy committee. Their first exposure to anything is the board, but they might have the bandwidth to also, or desire to want to actually participate in one of the other committees. They could go to the ARC, even though they don't have the police policy experience. Is that, because a board member does not follow under to be eligible for nominations for the ARC. They have to serve. Correct?
right, well, the recommendation is to eliminate that prior experience requirement.
Okay.
So that would open it up to anyone, but
Okay.
anyone who serves in a discipline-specific capacity on the board is automatically a part of.
Right.
So if you're representing the police discipline on the board, then you're serving on the police policy committee. Corrections. So that's why but yes, they could show up at their first board meeting and that be their first ever board meeting and they say, yeah, I'll do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah.
With this new recommendation to change the experience requirement. Yeah.
Just want to make sure we didn't see an unanticipated barrier.
Yeah. Okay. So that's our review of the applicant review committee and the pre-employment standards. But I don't want to just run on without providing the opportunity for anyone to ask any follow-up questions or any additional thoughts about pre-employment and applicant review committee. Want to give that space?
Robert, for the record, Jennifer, you're gonna beat me up for this, but, we didn't talk about changing the number of members on ARC.
Okay.
And, the engineer and me were trying some numbers. Going to 8 doesn't change the numbers, but going to 9 does. If you change it to 9 people, then you can lose up to, 4 people and still have a quorum. So I'm just putting that out there. If we change it so there's 3 from each or something, or somehow get 9 members, I think you have a better chance of reaching the quorum every time.
So 3 from each of the committees and then at least 1 board member.
10.
That's 10.
Mhm.
That's the same as 9.
The same math, yeah.
But-
You could still have
So
four.
9 and 10 would each allow 4 people not to be
Yeah.
present.
And Kevin, Norman, for the record, by the changes you guys have recommended on who can sit on it from a board member and keeping that 7, but knowing that we just need 4, I think we might get the consistency that we need.
Okay.
For that and changing that you don't have to have a full
Yes.
year,
Yeah.
full 2-year term in first, opens up the door for people that have wanted to do it that weren't able to when they wanted to.
Right.
Yeah.
Good point.
And have a more open time commitment.
Yeah. But I would, if we would go with those changes and not add at this time, be happy to kind of monitor that closely and then come back with, you know, if we're still trending, that may again indicate people are overtaxed and, might have to look at that as a specific problem.
So what is the consensus on membership? Maintain the numbers or change the numbers at this time?
That's Sean Clark. I would move to maintain them for now.
Great, okay. Okay, all right.
Online, are you guys good with maintaining? With the changes you guys have
Mhm.
recommended already?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for making sure that we
Yes.
talked.
I
Yeah.
wasn't advocating. I was putting-
Yeah. So I brought it up.
So I do. appreciate
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Right. Any other pre-employment or applicant review committee thoughts? Mark?
In the future, if you do go to 9, you can still do 2 from each committee, 1 from the board, and have like 2 at large. They could come from any committee or the board. Just a suggestion for the future.
Shannon Anderson on that. I had also been thinking about whether folks could come from other places or other boards, but I think that the understanding that you get from those particular boards for having people enter the profession might be kind of relevant and important. So I was just kind of going back and forth myself on that.
The 2 at large would come from any of the 3 committees. So it wouldn't have to, you wouldn't have necessarily 3 from each committee and 1 from the board. It could be 2 from one, 3 from another, 2 from one, 2 board members possibly. So
Right.
it'd be within that 4.
Just mixing and matching is what you're
Right,
proposing.
yeah, minimum of 2 from each committee, 1 from the board, and then 2 at large from any of those 4. That's what I was just thinking. It doesn't really matter to me. It's another way of doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. It gives you more flexibility.
Thank you. Okay. Then I have 30 minutes to talk to you about complaints. Right? Yep. Okay, 30 minutes to talk to you about complaints. Because DPSST is the regulatory body for providing the certification for public safety officers, we receive complaints. We receive complaints from members of the public that, I mean, and it's a wide variety of things. People submit complaints to DPSST. All complaints are maintained according to public records law. and records retention schedules. And anyone can submit a complaint to DPSST. If you submit a complaint to DPSST, you can request to be anonymous. We will do that to the extent possible, but if we have to forward the complaint to the employer and the employer has to investigate it, we may need to share that in order for them to be able to conduct their investigation, right? Into the conduct. So we do explain that to the complainant whenever that is done. DPSST does review each complaint that it receives, and we are reviewing it to determine if the conduct in the complaint is something that falls within the DPSST's jurisdiction. And when we say that, we're talking about what does the board have the authority to do? Well, the board has the authority to set the minimum standards for employment, training, and certification. And that's physical fitness, moral fitness, minimum education. So it's those minimum standards. So a lot of things that we receive complaints on are not anything that the board could take action on to deny or revoke a certification. So those are then non-jurisdictional. If it's something that would be something that the complaint is this person lied about their education, then that would be something that we could look into because if it were found to be true, because that is a minimum standard that they have to have in order to be employed and certified, those types of things. So if the complaint is outside board jurisdiction, DPSST closes its review of the complaints, notifies the complainant that the allegations are non-jurisdictional. We then forward a copy of the complaint to the employing agency if that officer is employed. If there's any possibility that the complaint may fall within the board's jurisdiction, DPSST forwards the complaint to the employing agency if the officer is employed. The complainant is notified that the complaint is forwarded to the employing agency and that any further investigation of that complaint is the responsibility of the employing agency. By rule, DPSST requires the employing agency to respond to DPSST's notice of that complaint. And we're asking them to respond that they've reviewed the complaint and essentially said that they've handled it in the manner that they see fit. They don't have to report to us what they did or if it resulted in discipline at this time. So we do that by sending them a form letter that they sign and return back to DPSST.
And just to add, Captain Copper for the record, except for if it is, they find it sustained and then it meets the reporting requirements of economic sanction and or there is a separation, then it follows the normal reporting processes. And that's what we'll get notified that, something more egregious probably happened.
So DPSST does not conduct an independent investigation into complaints against the public safety officer. DPSST's role with moral fitness standards and review of complaints remains secondary to the employer, regardless of the severity or frequency of the complaints of the alleged misconduct committed. Past moral fitness work groups found that independent DPSST investigation into complaints would directly interfere with the employing agency's operations and collective bargaining agreements and could negate their local control of their employment processes regarding disciplinary actions. So using our current rules and processes, DPSST will take additional compliance steps under specific circumstances. So if we receive a complaint and the public safety officer separates from employment or is criminally charged as a result of the alleged misconduct, DPSST will open the professional standards case and it's processed according to those standard mandatory or discretionary moral fitness rules and guidelines. But that's because it has either of those circumstances that already exist in rule, the separation of employment or the criminal disposition. So we're actually taking action on those circumstances, not on the complaint. It's just that the complaint led to those. If there is a complaint that is jurisdictional, so something that the board could deny, suspend, or revoke for, but the public safety officer is no longer employed, or the employing agency is non-responsive, so they won't reply to DPSST to acknowledge that they've received and handled the complaints. Or if the complaint is against an elected sheriff, DPSST can present the complaints to the appropriate policy committee for direction on whether or not to open a professional standards case to conduct investigations. When that occurs, before it goes to the policy committee, DPSST notifies the subject of the complaint. That subject of the complaint has the opportunity to provide mitigation or rebuttal statements. DPSST staff can review that information to determine if it allows us to make a determination of whether it's jurisdictional or not jurisdictional. If it's still jurisdictional, then it would be forwarded on to the policy committee to determine whether or not the case is open for complete review. Again, DPSST's ability to conduct an independent investigation is limited. DPSST does not have the authority to conduct criminal investigations, so those would always have to be forwarded out to a criminal justice agency. Any further investigation of a complaint beyond the facts or investigations that can be collected from other sources may require external resources depending upon the nature of the allegations. So we're limited in what we have the ability to do. If we were directed to conduct an investigation, professional standards case, we would have to probably seek additional sources to do that. We put in some statistics in the memo for you so you could see an average number of the complaints that we receive on an annual basis. And then we've only recently started tracking some higher level numbers beyond just what the number of complaints are. So to the discussion on what DPSST does with complaints and how we handle complaints, we have a recommendation from the Secretary of State's audit that was conducted in 2021. And the Secretary of State recommended that complaints containing allegations that would violate statutory and administrative rule requirements for certifications, that DPSST should go further than saying the law enforcement agency should respond that they've received the complaint and handled it, but they should provide a brief synopsis of what they did with the complaints, whether there was an investigation, and whether there were any underlying allegations that were sustained and discipline imposed. So the Secretary of State recommended that DPSST require more information on what is happening with the complaints. So that's something to consider in our discussions as we move forward. I also wanted to re-review the duty to report process. We talked about that earlier in work group meetings when we were reviewing previously passed legislation and what those effects were. So DPSST coordinates any reports submitted under the duty to report similarly to complaints. So when the law passed and was established, it says DPSST has to provide a form for police officers and reserve officers to submit reports of misconduct. At the time, our administration decided we would update our complaint form to include a place to say, I am a police officer, I'm a reserve officer. So we just use the same complaint form that we have. And you just submit everything through that. If a police officer or a reserve officer chooses to report to DPSST that duty to report misconduct, DPSST then forwards the report to the law enforcement unit that employs the subject individual, and DPSST follows the statutory requirement to forward that report to a person who has the authority to direct an investigation, and we have to forward that within 72 hours of receiving our complaint from the police officer or reserve officer. Then the law enforcement unit that receives that report of misconduct through the DPSST complaint process, they're required to investigate that reported misconduct or violation within 3 months of receipt of that report. And all of that is outlined in statute when they pass that duty to report misconduct and duty to intervene laws. If the investigation sustains findings of misconduct, the law enforcement unit is required to notify DPSST. But there are currently no prescribed timelines for notifying DPSST or how to notify DPSST or what needs to be included in that notice, or what DPSST should do, if anything, upon receiving that sustained violation of a duty to report misconduct. Okay, that's a lot of overview and talking. We provided a copy of the administrative rule for the complaint process, but I basically went through each of the steps in that overview. So if we start to look at the discussion points on page 4, we wanted to start with, what are your questions, concerns, or recommendations related to processes for reviewing complaints or allegations of misconduct? So just broadly, what kind of questions and concerns do you all have with current processes?
I'll let you know for the record. I'm not sure if I missed this, but is there any penalty for not responding to? Do you have any real teeth?
No.
Okay, well, something needs to happen then. Because I'm sure it's gonna happen, that somebody says, we're done, we're not giving you any more information. So what's this, would you have to go back, get an administrative rule or some kind of authority?
I honestly don't know if we could do it by administrative rule. We'd have to probably find out from Department of Justice, which does our legal counsel, what our authority is, because most of the board's authority is about the minimum standards for the individual officers, not telling what the employers, what they have to do.
Right.
Yeah.
It's tricky.
Yeah, we have, Captain Cop on the record, we have civil penalty ability when agencies are non-compliant, like in maintenance and stuff like that. But when Kathy Fink and I have just come here and tried to peel back that, nobody could historically say that that was ever assessed and that has been acted upon. So we don't have any actual knowledge of how that process would work under those circumstances, because it's never been utilized.
And civil penalty is very limited to
Yes.
meeting the basic certification requirement, the timelines for training and becoming certified. So that 18 months or that 12-month period. And then, yes, historically, we've just never gotten to that point, because that would be one government entity charging another government entity a civil penalty.
Right.
So,
Juggling any.
well, I'll go ahead, Sheriff Vandenberg.
Yeah, so I have a question. I'm looking at the Secretary of State's audit. So because a lot of the we received your communications regarding complaints, allegations. I signed the form and we sent it back to you within the required time. And I've always thought it was interesting that there's no follow-up from DPSST, but I'm looking at the Secretary of State's audit recommendation, and it said for allegations that violate the statutory and administrative rule requirements for certification. Can you just briefly talk about what that is? Because some of the complaints we get through, I don't believe the majority don't trigger the statutory administrative rule requirements for certification. Am I Is there,
Right.
do you have a list or what triggers that? What they're in general, what they're talking about?
And I think that they would be referring to what the board would be able to take action on. So if we reported it to the employing agency as something that we considered to be jurisdictional, then that would be something that would fall into that. That would be my interpretation. If DPSST is saying we consider this to be potentially jurisdictional if proven to be true.
So there would be two kinds of notifications. One that you would identify as triggering the certification, like a higher level, say like a level 1 and a level 2. You would identify that for the agency to say, these things potentially violate these things. We would like to a follow-up of what you did with this complaint when you're done.
Yes. So if we received a complaint and we said that this is not jurisdictional, then it would just be forwarding to the employing agency for informational purposes only. But because it doesn't fall under anything that the board can take action on, then it would just be that informational only.
We're just an agency that receives complaints. And so we'd be just another, conduit to receive them. Maybe somebody thinks that, it's safer to do it through us, and so they might send it. Since I've been here, I believe people are under the belief that we are a third-party entity that actually investigates complaints, even though we clearly say it on the website and we try and educate them. But I think there's still a belief that they can come to us for resolution, because perhaps they've even brought it to the home agency and felt like they weren't heard or nobody was held accountable. So then it comes back to us. Those are probably the ones I see more recently.
Okay, and I just one more comment. So for folks who use our portal and report to us, we have a process in place that does what the audit recommendation recommends in these, and it's, you know, that the complaint was sustained. We don't say what the level of discipline is, but whether a discipline imposed. And so there are recommendations in alignment with practices that we do. But obviously it varies from agency to agency. So I would not have any heartburn about reporting back to DPSST on those that trigger those higher level concerns of DPSST with that information that is requested by or recommended in the Secretary of State's audit. And that would be in alignment with our practices and sorry, because I view you as the complainant. You're sending the complaint through. We're following back through, notifying the complainant of these things.
And then within your agency, is that a matter of public record? Are those public records?
Our professional our internal affairs investigations.
Complaints and the response to the complaint.
The complaint, I believe the complaint, and then that piece is, I believe, public information.
Okay. Because that would occur here at DPSST. The complaint that we received from the public member is a public record, and then anything that corresponds with that. So the form letter that we send to your agency with a copy of the complaint is part of that public record, and then the signed version of it that is the response, the current response requirement is part of that public record. So if we were to say agencies, you need to report back this list of responses, then that report back would also then become part of that complaint public record.
And Captain McCollum, for the record, in fact, that was a desire of a sheriff recently who received one of our complaints through DPSST and acknowledged that we've already looked at this. I have the whole case. He goes, can I, when I sign my my, the DPSST form, can I also attach the letter that I sent to the complainant that says, you know, we looked into it, this is what we found, and so that for the desire that if there was a public records request, they wanted that document to be released as well as an acknowledgement that they looked into it and found it, and that I think in this case, it was unfounded. So I've had at least in the last 8 months, at least one sheriff, and I said, I don't think there's anything that prohibits you from doing that. We'll accept it and it'll just be part of the record. So I know there was at least that one thought process since I've been here.
Are there any other agencies that would comment on how much of a challenge it would be to provide that expanded response or concerns with, meeting that Secretary of State recommendation?
Shannon Anderson, I think that the analogy of DPSST being the complainant works right into what we would view it as well. And so I think it's the process that we would already be doing. It just happens to be you all.
Captain McAlpine, for the record, clarifying then, Chief, would you, if you reviewed us as a complainant, I'm gonna assume you would still contact the complainant and then communicate the resolution. So you'd almost have dual complainants, is that correct? You wouldn't
Yeah.
Okay, just want to make sure.
I think it would be not appropriate. Well, you could reach out to the complainant and say, you know, we have forwarded this on to another agency. That would be totally appropriate. And so, yeah, you do have dual complainant roles, and you have dual roles, and that you're forwarding it to us and somebody has forwarded it to you. It's complex, but totally doable. I guess I would not expect you though to give information about, I get it that it's public record, but it wouldn't be up to you to call the complainant and say, hey, OSU said that they investigated it and this is what they did with it and this is what happened. And like, I wouldn't see that as your role.
And nor would we take on that role. Absolutely, no. Like I said, we will, if they're asking, they see the form letter, it's very clearly states this is going to the home agency. And then, as stated, if we actually have some teeth in this that shouldn't be sustained, like, let's just say an excessive force, then it's jurisdictional and we would want to, you know, then we need that acknowledgement saying you are looking into it.
Chief Daniel?
Thanks. I just wanted to say I agree with Chief Anderson wholly and completely. So thank you.
Sheriff Brandenburg.
Yeah, and I think as part of that process, we need to recognize the due process of the employees. And so I would say, just like we do for economic sanctions, that the report back doesn't happen until the full process, if that includes arbitration, goes through to ensure that you know, the employee has the due process that they deserve.
Thank you. So while it looks like I had a lot of discussion points, all of that covered what I had outlined in that page. Let me look at 4, 5, and 6 here real quick. Okay, DPSST forwards each complaint to the employing agency. Is there anything different that DPSST should do when there are multiple complaints made against the same officer or agency over time. Right now, we receive the complaint, we forward the complaint, but there's no escalating action if there's multiple complaints over time about the same person or same agency. Oh, go ahead.
I feel like we're all like, I guess. So for me as a chief, when I have multiple complaints, I'm looking into it. What is the trend? What is going on? Have we been addressing it? Is what we're doing working? I'm looking at all of those things. I don't think that would be your role in this. And so I think you just have to keep forwarding them on, and maybe there can be, an offline discussion that so that we know that the chief is aware that this is happening. But I'm not sure that that's your role. That's our role as the leaders of the organization.
Jennifer Lavario for the record. I'm gonna just say that I think DOC would probably have, there probably would be a larger impact in some of these for them, based on some of the recurring complaints that we get from AICs that aren't jurisdictional, many of them. Our staff get inundated sometimes with AIC complaints that aren't jurisdictional. And I would also say that DOC, because there's nobody here really speaking for them, just knowing about records, submissions from them, that they do have some trouble, some challenges, I should say, with returning investigative information to us, probably based on many factors. So if there are time elements involved in returning a response to a complaint, the impact to DOC may be different than the impact to a police agency, just as points of information.
Thank you. Okay. We have a couple more discussion items, but they really get into the deep process of what do we do when we have to take a complaint to the policy committee? And those are going to take a little bit of time to parse out. So I do want to table 5 and 6 for our next meeting, but I'm not going to adjourn yet. John, you had your hand up.
Thanks. John Frost for record. I just kind of want to touch on what Jennifer was saying. Being a union steward, I've been involved with a lot of investigations representing staff. And I know at Snake River right now, we have a whole lot of internal investigations going on for complaints from AICs and staff on staff issues. So some of these investigations have been going on for 6 months, a year. And it's frustrating to me because I'm having to represent staff that is being dragged through the mud, basically. But a lot of these AIC things are investigated, and there's a lot of inundation of allegations that need to be investigated, and sometimes they are true and sometimes they're not. And I can see how this could become a big a project, if we start getting allegations to DPSST from family members of AICs, hey, so-and-so did this to my child at Snake River or at Powder or wherever, and it could become a lot. So that was just my thought. I just wanted to agree with Jennifer about it.
Thank you. Any other last minute questions or thoughts that we can put on the agenda or to pick up whenever we come back for finishing up complaints next time? Anything else that I need to bring up for another meeting? So to bring back any lingering questions from the past meetings and past discussions? I do still have a list of things that we're going to respond from pending discussions, but anything new that's been kind of in the back of your mind, rumbling around as the.
For the record, there was discussions about 3 or 4 days ago about economic sanctions and the definitions of those and what triggers such on reporting, and a lot of concerns, a lot of consternation going around the room. Did we come to any conclusions or any recommendations as a work group on that?
The pending question was, what were the definitions of a police officer, law enforcement officer that were used? And I will be able to report back in our next meeting on that. Because there was a question of, do we need to try to expand that to more than just the statutory language of police officers and reserve officers? So we'll be able to wrap back around to that. But yes, another part of that is, what is an economic sanction? And it is different from one agency to the next agency. And if there's the ability to standardize that. So I can report back on that. All right. Okay. So I'll start the thank yous and appreciations. And your time is so valuable and your conversations help us so immensely. So I just want to thank you all so very much. I don't have, I mean, if I had to give you my best guess of the next time that we were going to meet, I would probably say the beginning of December. Because we will be running into the Thanksgiving holiday. If we were going to go about a month from now, and I do have a lot of work.
November, we have all the committees.
Yeah, and I have a lot of work to prepare for you all, to give you more information to get us to our finish line. So I would project the beginning of December, and because I know December is really busy, I will get a scheduling poll so that we have a date and time set aside to meet. But is that okay with everybody? All right, again, thank you so much. You are so appreciated. I really thank you. And have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.